really none of that matters if you don't have a structure in place where decision makers have the authority to address all of those issues, right? Because at the end of the day, if a company is still authorizing procurement to, get the lowest cost volume widget or whatever it is, then that authority is going to supersede any sort of UFLPA focused risk. And so as a result, I would always just encourage not only clients, but folks that are listening to this and maybe thinking about how do I actually detect forced labor within my supply chain? How do I detect human rights abuses within my customer set or my supply chain? And then more importantly, where in the decision-making process is a go or a no-go decision going to be made on a customer, a vendor, a supplier, an investor, a partner, whatever the case may be?
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Hidden Traffic. My name is Gwen Hassan, and I am thrilled today to have with me as my guest Kit Conklin. He is a vice president with Kharon in Washington, D.C., but is also a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. Hi, Kit. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, pleasure. Thanks.
So let's start off with a little bit of background on you. Tell our listeners, how did you come to work for Kharon? How did you start working with the Atlantic Council? How did you get into this space?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. My background was really spent inside of the US government working on supply chain issues, sanctions, and export controls. Working on forced labor was a natural continuation of that work that I did inside of government. Before joining Kharon, I really specialized in providing the intelligence needed to OFAC for sanctions designations, to commerce for entity listings, and now, of course, CBP has spent a considerable amount of time creating a similar infrastructure and intelligence process to designate companies and target shipments related to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
That's actually my entree into human trafficking as well, was through trade, was doing OFAC screening and setting up foreign visitor screening, and ITAR work is how I segued into this space as well. So tell us a little bit about Kharon. Is it fair to describe it as a data analytics company, or is that too small of a definition?
It's certainly fair. I would just say at a high level, we specialize in using human subject matter expert analysts to detect forced labor risk, sanctions risk, and export control risk. And we take that research that we do and we turn it into a data product that clients can subscribe to for screening, transparency, traceability, supply chain mapping.
So is the data set itself then is something that people buy from Kharon? Is there a tool that goes with it, or is it tool agnostic? Like people could have their own system and just buy your data set?
Yeah, all of the above. We at Kharon specialize in the research itself. So we publish our research on these types of issues into a graph database that clients can use to search for parties, vendors, customers, that kind of thing. But we also provide a data feed. So banks, companies can subscribe to our data, integrate that data into third-party vendors. We have nearly 30 partners where we can integrate our forced labor data into those types of solutions. Or if you've got kind of a homegrown system for supply chain mapping, transparency, traceability, or denied party screening, we're able to integrate that as well.
That's fantastic. Okay, let's pivot and tell me a little bit about what the Atlantic Council does. I know they're an NGO, but what specifically is their space?
Yeah, so the Atlantic Council is one of the preeminent think tanks in Washington, and my particular role with the Atlantic Council is focusing on the intersection of technology and national security. And so as we think about trade, as we think about financial flows, there's a huge amount of data involved in those types of transactions. As you undoubtedly know from your time working on OFAC screening, the amount of data out there is just huge. And so creating the technology infrastructures to actually make sense of what the data is requires a lot of expertise and time thinking about those issues and deploying solutions. So the Atlantic Council helps bridge the divide between the public sector with agencies, the White House, Congress, et cetera, and how industry can actually make sense and take action against new regulations. So we kind of fit perfectly between industry, academia, and government.
You're kind of operating as a translator more or less, right? As you're taking what the government wants and trying to translate it into a way that's actionable for business. Fair.
That's right.
All
So
right.
a lot of times you have language that's being drafted either as executive orders with the White House or
Yeah.
perhaps over on the Hill, and
Mhm.
maybe it's quite complex, right? And maybe the requirement is too burdensome, or maybe the technology to actually comply with that regulation isn't yet available. So that
Yeah,
creates all
exactly.
sorts of all sorts of challenges for both policymakers and for industry.
I didn't know that that's what the Atlantic Council did. What a great role to be in, because having worked in industry for, decades now, very often have encountered that situation where you're like, well, sure, we'd love to comply with this, but we don't have a system for that. What do you mean? How can we automate that? Well, good. Thank you. Tell us a little bit about, we're going to go back to Kharon now, about how that data set can be used in a real world example for human trafficking or forced labor prevention. I'm not asking you to talk about specific clients. So, uh, no names basis, if you could give me an idea, like how could someone use the tool in a supply chain integrity context? Any examples you can share?
Yeah, happy to. So when we think about forced labor, it's really around the government guidance. In particular, I'll just kind of focus today on the UFLPA, but the same kind of best practices apply for the new German supply chain law, the proposed
Mm-hmm.
Canadian forced labor ban, the proposed EU ban. These jurisdictions obviously have different requirements with each regulation, but let's take, for example, the UFLPA. So the Xinjiang Supply Chain Business Advisory published in 2020, updated in 2021, and then incorporated into the UFLPA, these documents, they list red flags for forced labor as they relate to Xinjiang and Uyghur forced labor in particular. So these are things, for example, like companies in Xinjiang that are co-located with prisons or internment camps, vocational
Mm.
schools, re-education centers. And then the law effectively bans any supply chain that's connected back into these red flags. So you have this rebuttable presumption with the UFLPA that dictates to industry that every product that essentially is sourced from Xinjiang or connected in some way, shape, or form to those red flags poses risk and is therefore banned from being imported into the United States. So the data that we've developed is derived around those red flags. So we have teams of analysts that speak Chinese. They spend all day, every day looking to identify those types of red flags. So in the prisons example, what that means is we've spent a huge amount of time mapping out all of the prisons, the internment camps in Xinjiang, and then layering on top of that open source information to figure out what are those companies that are operating inside of those prisons or adjacent to those prisons or those
Mm-hmm.
internment camps, or what are the mines or the farms that are affiliated with those camps. And then from there, following those supply chains wherever they go. So if you're a company and you're a brand trying to make sense of your supply chain, you have two kind of key issues that you have to think about from the UFLPA perspective. The first is what is your supply chain, right? So your tier ones, your tier twos, your tier threes. And then within that, where is the actual risk? And
Yeah.
Kharon provides that piece. We work with partners across industry to include dozens of companies that provide that traceability and supply chain mapping for clients. We at Kharon just specialize in the risk. So the use case really for our research and our data is to help you make sense of where the actual forced labor red flags are within your supply chain and not providing all of that mapping for you.
Yeah, that is, I mean, it's such a daunting task from the business side when you think about, okay, many places don't even know what their supply chain looks like, let alone down to, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 levels. And then kind of the information vacuum is perceived to be, okay, now I know what my supply chain looks like, which took me a few years to put together. But how do I know where the risk is? And so that's where your data set comes in. You're doing the local heavy lifting, which is invaluable to companies because they have no way of knowing what's happening in a mine in the far western side of China, for that matter. Okay, that makes sense. You mentioned the UFLPA and you mentioned the German Act, now the Supply Chain Act. We now have proposed that new EU corporate sustainability reporting directive that won't come into play for another few years, but people should be working on getting ready to comply with that now, arguably. That's going to require companies to be able to show that they've done adequate diligence from a human rights standpoint on their entire supply chain, at least as it relates to Europe. So I know you talked about the forced labor indicators. Are there also indicators within the data set of other types of human rights violations or human rights issues, or is it limited right now to kind of forced labor and human trafficking?
So we specialize in issues at the intersection of global trade and international security and finance. So as a result, we naturally capture those controversial issues around the world to include not only the UFLPA, but broader human rights issues writ large. And the reason for that is our background and experience inside of government was really spent focusing on the tools of economic statecraft that the US government, the EU, the UK, other allied democracies around the world had to combat some of these issues. So when we think about these types of issues at Kharon, we really put on our former government hats and we think about this from the perspective of what are all of those regulations that are out there that the US government and other governments use to combat human rights violators, corruption, deforestation, global crime, narcotics. There's a couple of things that jump out. The first is that you have import bans, similar to the new proposed EU ban, the Canadian proposed ban, obviously the UFLPA. Then you have export bans on specific types of technologies, things like export controls going into countries or companies that are using surveillance technology to suppress human rights overseas, not just in China, but around the world. But then you also have other blanket kind of restrictions like sanctions that are targeting human rights abusers globally. So things, for example, like the Global Magnitsky Act, originally targeting Russian human rights offenders, but now that's been expanded to look at human rights abuses globally. And you also have sanctions policy targeting corrupt actors in South America most recently, but certainly around the world as well. So we at Kharon specialize in providing that human research, that human subject matter expertise to examine all of those issues, really at the intersection of global security and trade and finance.
Excellent. I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know that Kharon had that kind of data set until now. So I'm really glad I'm learning about it too, just from my standpoint. That's excellent. Good. Talk with me for a minute about people who are coming in from a corporation where they've grown by acquisition, as many companies do. And so they've got a million different legacy systems. Some of them, most recently, I have worked with a client who had 10 different instances of SAP in the same company because they had acquired people who had different systems and different systems. Sometimes they've got one tool that might be used for sanction screening, and then they've got another tool that's used for third-party due diligence, and then maybe another tool that's used for, money laundering prevention. That leads to a lot of inefficiency, right? And a lot of duplication of systems and effort. I mean, based on what you're seeing with clients, and for that matter, with companies that you work with through the Atlantic Council, do you think it's reasonable for a company to try and meet all of those needs with one tool, given the kind of improvement we're seeing around data and analytics and technology? Or is it more likely that they will still have kind of duplication and overlap? What are you seeing?
It's the $1 million literal question within the industry right now. I would say at a high level, the key thing that I see that makes the most impact for companies and banks that are thinking about, the future of data programs really boils down to where the decision making takes place within an organization. So, for example, the UFLPA is really a perfect example, I think, of a perfect gap in most companies' compliance programs. It's not exactly sanctions compliance, it's not export control compliance, it's not procurement's necessary background and responsibility, it's not really supply chains background. General counsel obviously cares about it, but who actually makes that decision, right? Because each one of those organizations, each one of those offices, procurement, supply chain, due diligence, sanctions and trade compliance, traditionally they all have separate tools. And they've got tools that are developed and built to support their specific use case. Whereas you have these new regulations like the UFLPA that are forcing groups within a company, within a bank, to start thinking a little bit more strategically about why certain tools are used. Do we still need some of these legacy providers? In some instance, the answer is absolutely yes. It makes sense. There's cost efficiencies. More importantly, there's operational efficiencies with not having to do a rip and replace. There's all sorts of challenges when it comes to integrating new tools. There's also obvious upshot, but really none of that matters if you don't have a structure in place where decision makers have the authority to address all of those issues, right? Because at the end of the day, if a company is still authorizing procurement to, get the lowest cost volume widget or whatever it is, then that authority is going to supersede any sort of UFLPA focused risk. And so as a result, I would always just encourage not only clients, but folks that are listening to this and maybe thinking about, how do I actually detect forced labor within my supply chain? How do I detect human rights abuses within my customer set or my supply chain? And then more importantly, where in the decision-making process is a go or a no-go decision going to be made on a customer, a vendor, a supplier, an investor, a partner, whatever the case may be?
Do you see any of this changing recently, and when I say recently, I mean within the last maybe 5-ish years around the conversations with ESG? I'm starting to see that maybe there is some hope in terms of who the decision maker is, because the concept of corporate sustainability and corporate social responsibility are all being kind of subsumed in this ESG conversation that is tending to end up with an ESG committee or an ESG actual task force, or in some cases, even a C-suite officer that is designated as the head of ESG, which might theoretically at least lead to kind of higher and more uniform level decision making when it comes to these things. Are you seeing any of that yet, or is it too soon?
Definitely. And the real reality, I would say, when it comes to ESG versus some of the more strict requirements around, for example, the UFLPA or sanctions compliance, is the programs and the software systems that are built for ESG really have focused historically over the last several years on climate.
Yeah,
So CO2
environmental,
emissions,
carbon.
data,
Yeah.
exactly. Data for understanding the new EU law on imports, for carbon emissions, for tax purposes. There's entire ecosystems that are built around that type of issue that in no way, shape, or form traditionally have any sort of compliance function to them, that are beyond more environmentally focused objectives. So when it comes to understanding your supply chain, when it comes to other elements of ESG beyond just climate, there are separate tools, there are separate systems, and there are separate decision-making infrastructures in place within a company that really challenge, I would say, this notion that there could be one data lake that provides the answers to every party, every constituent within an organization in a responsible way.
Well, I hope that we will see that change over the next decade or so, and we'll move towards a place where, you end up with one tool, crazy thought, that might be able to amalgamate all of that data and information, to your point, from a data lake. But having worked in a number of organizations that either didn't have a data lake or had a partial data lake or wasn't sure what a data lake was, I can see it's an uphill climb for sure. So thank you so much for joining me. We're close to the end of time here. Any final thoughts that you wanted to share, Kit, before we wrap up?
No, pleasure to be here. It's certainly a complex issue, and best of luck to all of us as we try to collectively figure out how to appropriately respond to these new regulations. I would just say that my final thought here is that the regulations are coming. There's going to be a lot more of them over the next 12 to 24 months. So it should be an exciting ride.
Hey, where can people get in touch with you if they want to continue the conversation or learn more about Kharon, or for that matter, the Atlantic Council?
Sure. Happy to connect. Feel free to send an email directly to me at conklink@kharon.com. Or if you want to get in touch via LinkedIn, happy to support. You can always reach out to Kharon's website as well if you want to have a demo or hear any more about our research. The same goes if you ever want to discuss relationships with the Atlantic Council. Always feel free to reach out.